So there are very few topics that rile up the Call of Duty player base more than skill-based matchmaking. The system that we have now is an algorithm-based system that basically, on paper at least, will match people of similar skills so that everybody can have a good, fun, competitive time playing Call of Duty. In practice, we don't really get that. The top players are basically forced to play World Series of Warzone level competitiveness every time they log on, and there's no escape for that. The middle of the pack kind of is a very sweaty group, and most of the time they're shoved up to fill lobbies against top players because there just aren't enough top players in the game for them to fill lobbies on the regular. So that's bad for the middle skilled players. And the lower skilled players, in theory, are going to be separated into their own lobbies and they get to play amongst themselves. However, the top players have figured out how various ways to break the matchmaking algorithm and get put into the lobbies with the lower skilled players. So they get, the lower skilled players are constantly faced with people that theoretically don't belong there. And unfortunately, as the player base dwindles over the course of the year, as the players churn out, then the algorithm stops working very well because there just aren't enough players at any given skill bracket to fill the lobby properly. So it has to open the doors, let the higher skilled players in anyways, which kind of defeats the whole point. The whole purpose goes away. And so last year I made a video, and I'll put the link down below where you can go in, where I asked the question, hey, what happens if we got rid of skill-based matchmaking and we actually just built lobbies totally random? And I built this with the idea that, hey, it's going to show that, the thing that we're all concerned about, which is top players stomping on the bots all the time and the bad players not having any fun, was going to, would happen all the time. And nobody would get to have any fun because, the scumps of the world would just come through and just mop every lobby and we'd all be miserable. What I actually found, which was quite interesting, and I'll stop here if you haven't seen the video. What I actually found is that the lobbies would actually be pretty balanced, right? The odds that you run into a really high skilled player is pretty low, right? About maybe 1 every 3 or 4 games, maybe, right? And we're talking Warzone here. So the question then became, okay, if that's the case, then why do we have the algorithm? Well, the reality is, and the thing that I didn't approach in that video was player churn, right? I looked at the player's skills and I said, hey, at the end of the day, you have to have a pretty well-balanced player base. You have to have players of all skill levels and of the right proportions for a random lobby to work. Otherwise, the random lobbies, it doesn't solve the problem, right? The random lobbies for most people will still feel miserable because there aren't enough players to fill out the lobby. So I actually had a conversation with Greg Reisdorf about a week or so ago on my podcast, and he talked about this very issue. He's very candid about it. I'm going to play that clip so that you and I can all be on the same page when we talk about what's coming next. Because after this clip, we're going to look at delving into what happens to lobbies as we get churn of players leaving the game. All right, so stay tuned, listen to this conversation, and then I'll catch you back on the next side.
The player count aspect of it is a huge part of it, right? Like how many players you have online at that specific time to be able to get into a lobby to play together with 150 people, all that kind of stuff. Like, you're starting to narrow your band of who you can actually play with. Or sorry, you don't narrow it. You're expanding your band of who you can play with because there's just not enough players, right? So you might have like a bunch of players and then you start to fill that band until you get enough players to go into your match. So what you're probably seeing is a lack of skill-based matchmaking in those situations where it gets really sweaty. And because if you're in a party, I forget how exactly it works. But let's say that it matches you with it's not going to match you with the top player. Like if the assumption, say it takes the aggregate, it's like baseline. It's like, oh, we have a skill of 1 and they have a skill of 1 and we're going to try and match these parties together. Within that skill, like one of those guys may be crazy high and just taking out everyone on your team. Right. And there's just the ability to control that skill is kind of crazy in that sense. So as you get into parties, you're kind of like gloves are off, man. Like you're kind of fucked. And it's most likely because you don't have skill-based matches. Like it's not of your skill that you're playing against. You're playing against drastically different people.
It's random. Like, so it feels like more random to me this year. And that's one of the things that we've both advocated for, I think, recently. And, Subone actually has a really good, he went through and did some modeling and some statistical analysis on this specific subject. And, I don't want to steal his thunder. I'll let him go over that with you. But it more or less proved my theory on how the matchmaking would work in a randomized lobby versus always trying to constantly manipulate all these different pieces to make it work.
Well, I think the thing that, it takes into consideration is that there's a large available player base of all skills, right? And so like I think the big problem is when you start to lose, kind of goes back to the casual kind of discussion, right? If you lose the casual lower skilled player base, then you can't have the random experience because there just isn't enough lower skilled players to fill out a lobby, right? Like ideally in my book, you want a bell curve of skill, right? Where it's like, there's a very small number of top 20% players and then a very small number of bottom 20% players, and most people are that 80% in the middle, and then it's kind of like it feels natural, right? And it feels competitive. Maybe you run into somebody who's really good, maybe you never see anybody better than you.
Well, as you're playing, if you don't have skill-based matchmaking, if this is your bell curve, right? You're constantly if this is your number of players, you're constantly shrinking your number of players from the bottom to the top, because those players at the bottom are getting the shit kicked out of them every time they go and play. And so they leave. And so then they starts to compress and compress and compress. And every time, like this guy, this is, scumps of the world, right? And here's your slightly above average player. And now you're playing scump more often because there's nobody below you. And then you just bounce, and then there's no one left at the end of the day. Which is the theory of like why you probably should have it if you're in a competitive online game. Right, in some way, shape, or form.
So I guess in theory, it's kind of going back to my initial question about the bots, right? Is if you can always
fill that bottom
bell curve, then the scump who's like a top 0.001% player, right? Your odds of running into that caliber of player is very low. But like, I think when J God was pulling player data, it was like the average, like the most common KD was like a 0.8, 0.85, somewhere in that range. And it's like when you look at like a 1 KD player, like an even player, they're like top 20% ish. And if I'm off base, let me know. But that was like what the data that came from the API was saying in Warzone 1. And it was a really interesting set of data of like how many people are actually like not good at the game. And as long as you have enough players that are not good at the game, then the bell curve works and there's enough room, then the odds that somebody will wipe the whole lobby with 150 kills under his belt is very, very small, because there just aren't that many of those caliber of players out there, right?
I think you will most likely see more and more bots in every online game, right, to fill that bottom bucket out with players. I would have done it in Modern 3 if I could have. It wasn't in the cards at the time. I would have put it in core multiplayer, which everybody will like lose their shit about, right? But it's fine because
Rivals is doing it.
Yeah, like you're if you want a good experience, like you don't like at some point you just kind of forget about them. And you're just having fun. You're having a good time. And you could go into ranked play and just have no bots in ranked play. And if you want to get all sweaty there, go there. So I am in the camp of like, you know what, you should do that because that's the experience. Like give the players what they want type of thing. Like players want to be able to go in, shoot somebody, have a good time shooting somebody, right? And like feel good about themselves.
In this situation, right? In theory, you can have a nice, easy, enjoyable lobby if you have a proper bell curve, which is most players are about average, give or take. And then you have outliers that are worse and outliers that are better. And it provides a pretty balanced feel to the game. All right. And so one of the things that I did that I haven't done before is I actually was able to build out a tool that lets us simulate what a lobby will look like if it's truly random, right? And you have a good amount of players. So in this chart, this is what a typical random lobby would look like, right? If you just had the proper, skill brackets filled out the way that they do in reality. And so Jay God and others have gone through, and when we had data, API data, they were able to get the distribution of skill. And so we've kind of I've mirrored that here in the data. My previous video goes into the details of how I do that. But the reality is most players end up in this middle skill bracket, right? The most common KD is about a 0.85. And so most players sit around that. And then, some players are worse. More players are, other players are better. And then, the number of better players drops off as you go up in skill. All right. And then when you have the distribution of skill, right, like in a normal scenario, you end up with like fewer people, very few people show up in this top 0.1%. These are the scumps of the world, the top 1%, right above a 2 KD. You might get 1 or 2 in a lobby, maybe, sometimes none. And then it just kind of breaks down. And this gives us a very normal skilled lobby, right? You've got some good players. Those good players may or may not win, right? They don't always win. In fact, a lot of times they don't make it that far because of their play style in pubs. Also, you have lower skilled players, and they don't win a lot either, but that's normal for lower skilled players. Most players sit in the middle, and in a balanced lobby, sometimes they win, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they have good games, sometimes they don't. But the reality is every game is going to feel kind of like a little different from every other game. And this is what we want. Ideally, this is kind of the ideal distribution of skill. But the problem is that skill changes over time. The distribution of players changes over time because players quit. Modern Warfare 2, Modern Warfare, or Black Ops 6, both of them lost about 40 to 45% of the player base between November and March. All right. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 never had those players to begin with, right? They didn't lose players during that period because those players didn't show up to begin with, right? They stayed by March, all of these games have had about the same number of players playing, all right? Which, is going to trend higher skilled. It's a higher, the number of players that will play through the full duration of the game are going to be higher skilled, more dedicated, more interested in playing competitively, which is great for those players. However, for the health of the lobbies, it isn't so great. And we usually hear the complaints being, skill-based matchmaking is cranked. Well, we know from looking at the math and looking at the models and everything else that it's not necessarily the case that skill-based matchmaking is cranked. If anything, there aren't enough players to fill out the bottom of the player bracket. So what I've done is I've come up with a system to kind of emulate that. We're going to simulate what happens when you remove a section of the player base, in this case, a below average, so 0.85, most common KD, the average player. We're going to remove players below that and look at what it does to the lobby, right? So as you start to drop players, the lobby mix starts to change and somewhat dramatically, right? So as you get closer, to this, you get about 40%, the lobbies become sweaty, right? They're generally much more challenging to play than they were before. And I don't know why it keeps moving. And as you increase it, if you lose up to like 40, 50%, you get into these very sweaty lobbies, right? In this case, I'm at 65% of these lower skilled players have quit. And you can look at what it does to the players that are above average. These players are still here, but now they make up significantly more of the lobby than they did before, right? Even with random lobbies, even with that, with removing SBMM, getting the algorithm out of here, as we lose the lower skilled player base, the lobbies become sweaty anyways. It doesn't solve the problem, right? So after talking to Greg and after looking at everything that's going on with Call of Duty, with casual mode, with all of these things that they're doing, I think it says, it tells me that that they are going to try and augment lobbies with these AI bots. And I think that makes a lot of sense. So this churn, all right, these lack of players, uh, is natural and a typical way. It is very normal for games to lose players over time, right? They don't stick. Not everybody sticks around and mains one game the whole time. They play it when it's hot, when it first comes out. They get kind of tired of it. Maybe they get stomped too much. Maybe they're just not, they've got other games that they want to play, right? So they play for a while and then they start to play less and less and less. And so the player base just drops off. It's just how it happens. And so what we do is we add, if we go in and we, instead of trying to tackle this problem with a algorithm, right, which is what we're doing, we've been trying to Call of Duty has been trying to tackle this with an algorithm this whole time, and it's not working. Everybody breaks the algorithm. The algorithm is feeding people all over the place. Heavens forbid you win your first game, right? You win your first game of the night. You might as well just sign off, because you're just going to be in the spin cycle from there on out for the rest of the day, and probably tomorrow too. All right, all in the effect of trying to recreate that balanced lobby feel that everybody likes to play in. But the reality is, there's another way. And I think we're seeing this because they're adding bots. And what you can see is, as you add bots, right, and you start to replace bots from humans, the lobby improves. The balance of the lobby and the feeling of it starts to drop off, right? The more bots you add. And eventually you can balance the lobby. In this case, this set balances to a more normal lobby with about 60 bots to 90 humans, right? A far cry from what we have right now with 128 bots or whatever it is to, a handful of people. But the goal is, if we can go in and we can balance the lobby, where you go in and sometimes you're going to run against players better than you, sometimes worse than you. But how do you do that when the worst players have stopped playing the game? And the answer, I think, the solution for the problem that we're facing is you have to start adding bots in. If you add the bots in, it actually balances the lobby. Now, I'm not talking your wall licking, can't move, can't shoot, stands there and waits to be cannon fodder bots. Right now, if you go into a casual mode, you will find bots that do operate similar to a lower skilled player. They look like a human player, and they can be confusing as to what you're facing. And they are getting better at hiding the names. They are getting better at tailoring the behavior to the behavior that you'd expect to see from somebody at a point, at a below average KD. All right. And the more of those that you actually run into or have in the game, and the more balanced it is, the better the lobby will play. Now, if you wanted to fully replace skill-based matchmaking, for example, and get rid of the algorithm the way that we understand it, you can still balance the lobby even with fewer players in it by adjusting the number of bots. Right. So if you wanted to say, give an easier lobby, you can increase the bots significantly, and the lobby gets easier, and more players have an opportunity to have more success. Right. This is similar to how the algorithm itself wants to tackle the issue. The algorithm wants to give people who have struggled more success, right, for a time, so that they can stay on the game. They can want to keep playing. They enjoy it better when they have more success. And so the algorithm does that now by trying to adjust the lobbies artificially. But it doesn't work very well, right? We know it doesn't work well. And we know what happens when you win your first game, right? Most of us have been there, where you win the first game of the night, or you do really well, you drop a lot of kills, maybe you push your PR, and then the rest of the night, the algorithm goes, oh, well, you're locked in and you're ready to go. So have a lobby that's going to really challenge you. And by challenge, you mean you're going to, you're going up against a really tough, a much tougher group of players, probably outside of your skill level. And this is what most of us experience. This is how the game is designed. So if we can get away from that sort of experience where, you're being forced into lobbies that are unbalanced and just naturally sweaty, right? And you can balance them by adding bots and providing a more random feeling experience, then the game will feel healthier. It will feel better. And I think this is the direction that Call of Duty is taking. Listening to what Greg said, looking at what they've been doing with these AI bots, looking to how they've been using them, especially with solos mode and how that mode is playing. This sort of scenario where they get rid of SBMM, it's not just about providing a better experience for low skilled players, which they absolutely could do by adjusting the bots and and tweaking things similar to how boot camp works, they can actually create a better experience for everybody, especially the high skilled players, right? Because when you have a lobby that is all high skilled players, and this is where I think things get really bad, when you get rid of all of the low skilled players and you have no bots, these lobbies are incredibly difficult, right? Especially if you're the bulk of these players, you're definitely running into, high skilled players much more frequently. And not only that, you are facing other players that are also very highly skilled. These sorts of lobbies, which I think Call of Duty tries to create now for the high skilled players, are miserable to play, right? Everybody who's matched with players slightly above their skill level or at their skill level will have a hard time playing. Will have a more difficult time playing, and it will feel very sweaty for them. However, when you get to the higher echelons of the game, there's no room for error, right? There's no room for mistake because players don't miss shots very often. They don't. They are very observant. They are very aware of their surroundings. Okay, these sort of these sort of lobbies are not fun to play in. I have been in these lobbies playing with other creators. I've watched players play in these lobbies, and they are utterly miserable, right? Unless you're playing for World Series of Warzone or money or something like that. If you just want to hop on and play, and this is the lobby that you're giving, I can't imagine anybody would sit there and say, "Oh, this is a lot of fun. I'm having a great time." Right? This is the sort of thing that you expect to see in ranked. This is the sort of thing you expect to see in customs competing for money, right? Like this is the pulse check, lobbies. This is where you want high competition, but nobody wants to play that every single day. So if you're a high skilled player, right, and you are being put into these sort of lobbies, the idea that this is going to be a fun experience for you is not there, right? People aren't going to enjoy these lobbies, and they are very vocal about it on social media that they don't enjoy these lobbies. And so the answer is, how do you fix this? How do you balance it? And Call of Duty's approach up till now has been, well, we're going to increase the algorithm. We're going to tweak the algorithm. We're going to adjust the algorithm. We're going to try and fix it through math, right? And I don't think that works. I think all that does is frustrate the high skill players. It frustrates most players as they are constantly faced with playing at or above their skill level. And as Greg mentioned, right, as the player base shrinks through natural attrition, through churn, you end up with, a higher skilled remaining player base anyways. So there aren't these opportunities to have more relaxing lobbies, to have more common, more random lobbies. Everything is going to feel sweaty. The whole game will just always feel sweaty. And I think that's the big problem that we have to solve. How do you get rid of the feeling where every lobby, every random public lobby feels like it's a ranked game, right? And I think that's where we're at now. And I think it's because you have to account for the churn. You have to deal with the fact that the lower skill players will stop playing the game, or they'll at least stop playing that mode. And maybe they'll play single player or zombies or something else instead of actually playing the main, BR experience. So if you can go in and remove the algorithm, generally speaking, and replace it with a system that augments lobbies with AI to create a balanced feel where you aren't overwhelming the lobby with high skilled players for the for that demographic, and you aren't creating these bot lobbies that when people get into them, they just decimate everything. But you can create a bell curve of skill so that everybody has an opportunity to succeed and to push themselves without being completely obliterated. It also limits the number of top level players that you're going to run into because there just aren't that many to spread around. You're creating more lobbies. You're spreading it around the high skilled players around more so that even the high skilled players will have more variety in the games that they play and generally enjoy their experience more, which, we know does affect how the game is perceived, right? If the high skilled players that are on social media, if they're on stream, if they're on video making content and they're enjoying themselves, it encourages other people to play, right? It's not the only driving factor, but it is a factor. It encourages people to play. People see that the game is fun when you have skill, but they hop on and they are lower skilled. They also have fun, right? Everybody can win in that way. versus the system that we have now, which will basically, through attrition of the natural attrition of the player base, make the game miserable for everybody. Nobody wins right now. And so I think as we see Call of Duty progress this system, and we see them experiment more and put more bots into more scenarios, if they go down this road, which I think they might be, but if they are going down this road, hopefully it's going to create a better, more balanced Warzone experience for all of us as the game goes on. So that's what I got. I want to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. What do you think of what Greg had to say? What do you think about what this tool showed? What do you think about bots in the game? Let me know, and I look forward to hearing from you. Catch you on the next one.